Welcome to our Friday reflection here at Gospel First. Today, we're not trying to cover more ground, we're letting the week settle into the heart. Matthew 13 isn't mainly about agriculture, it's about what happens inside us when God speaks, about the kind of heart that stays open, the kind of life that bears fruit slowly. So take a breath, let this be unhurried. And as we listen, don't ask, am I doing enough? Ask, is my heart staying open? Let's begin. Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 to 9, it's about the sower that goes forth. Matthew tells us in verse 3, it says, "Behold, a sower went forth to sow." Now, notice here that the seed is the same everywhere. The difference is the soil. Some seed falls by the wayside in verse 4. On verses 5 to 6, it says, "Some on stony ground." And then verse 7, "Some among thorns." And in verse 8, "Some on good ground." Now, Jesus is not criticizing people, he's inviting self-awareness. What's the principle here? The Word of God is constant. The heart's readiness determines growth. Next is about verses 10 to 17. The disciples ask in verse 10, "Why speakest thou unto them in parables?" Then in verse 13, Jesus answers them gently, "Because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand." Parables don't hide truth from humble hearts. They protect truth from indifference. Then Jesus in verses 16 says something that's really tender. "Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear." Well, spiritual understanding grows with desire, not intelligence. So something to think about here. Am I listening to God to be changed or just informed? Where might I need to soften my heart? Next, in Matthew verses 18 to 23, Jesus explains the parable. In verse 19, it says, "Some hear but do not understand. Then cometh the wicked one and catcheth them away, that which was sown. While some receive with joy, but lack depth. Yet hath he not root in himself," in verse 21. Then in verse 22, it says, "Some are choked by worry and distraction, the care of this world and the deceitfulness of riches." Verse 23 says, "But good soil beareth fruit and bringeth forth." Now, this is not about perfection. It's about remaining open. The principle here is spiritual fruit grows where the heart stays receptive over time. Next, we go into Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30, 36 to 43. Jesus tells of wheat growing alongside weeds. The servants want to pull the weeds immediately, but the master says in verse 29, "Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them." Now, Jesus teaches restraint here. God sees clearly what we see imperfectly. Premature judgment can damage real growth. Now, something to reflect on is, where do I need patience with myself or others? Can I trust God's timing more than my urgency? Next, we're going to see in verse 31 to 33, there's a small and hidden growth that comes. Now, Jesus compares the kingdom to a grain of mustard seed, the least of all seeds, verses 31 to 32, and to leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, verse 33. God's work often begins unnoticed, but quiet growth is still real growth. The principle here is that God works patiently and powerfully through small beginnings. Next, we're in verses 44 to 46 is where the treasure and the pearl are. In verse 44, Jesus speaks of hidden treasure. "For joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath. And a pearl of great price, who sold all that he had and bought it." That's verse 46. Notice that the kingdom is not forced. It is recognized, and when truly seen, it reshapes priorities. In verses 43, talks about who hath ears to hear. Now, Jesus closes with an invitation. In verse 43, he says, "Who hath ears to hear, let him hear." Not everyone hears the same message the same way, and Jesus allows space for that. So in closing, I want you to think about this. God is always sowing truth. The question is never whether he is speaking. The question is whether our hearts are ready to receive. So if today you feel distracted or unsure or are spiritually uneven, that does not disqualify you. It simply means God may be inviting you to tend the soil, gently, honestly, patiently. And he is willing to wait. Well, that brings us to the close of week 2. Thank you for staying faithful to the journey. May the Spirit continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. If your heart feels even a little nudge, I invite you to subscribe and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And we'll see you in week 3 as we continue walking with Matthew in Matthew chapter 14 to 15. Until then, God bless.